In the ancient lands where the sun burns like a golden god, a kingdom was rising built on the silent screams of the broken. But inside the towering walls of the palace, Princess Bithiah was fighting a war of her own. She was a woman who possessed the world, yet her heart was a desert barren and aching for a son that would never be. They say she found a basket by chance while bathing, but the truth is far darker. Driven by a desperate prophecy, she had been searching the riverbanks for a sign, a miracle, or a weapon to call her own. When she finally parted the reeds and saw that tiny crying infant, she didn't see a slave child marked for death. She saw her destiny. But in the heart of the Egyptian palace, secrets are never whispered, they are written in blood. Just as Bithiah's fingers brushed the rough wicker of the basket, the silence was shattered. A young palace guard patrolling the riverbank stepped out from behind a massive limestone pillar. The torch in his hand cast a flickering, hellish light over the scene. His eyes locked onto the infant, recognizing the forbidden Hebrew features and the mark of the covenant. He knew the law of Pharaoh: every Hebrew male must be fed to the crocodiles. He drew a deep breath, his lungs filling to shout the alarm that would bring a dozen more spears to the water's edge. The princess didn't plead. She didn't offer gold. In that split second, the motherly instinct she had prayed for transformed into a cold, lethal hunger. As the guard opened his mouth to sound the death knell for the child, Bithiah moved with the terrifying speed of a striking cobra. She lunged forward, a small ceremonial dagger hidden in her robes flashing under the moonlight. Before the first note of the alarm could leave the guard's throat, she drove the blade upward, buried deep beneath his jaw. The sound was sickening, a muffled gasp followed by the wet gurgle of a man drowning in his own life force. Bithiah didn't flinch. She held him close, almost like an embrace, as the torch fell into the mud and hissed out. She watched the light fade from his eyes, her own face a mask of stone. When she finally let him go, the Nile at her feet didn't just ripple. It turned a dark, bruised crimson. This was the first blood ever spilled to protect Moses. Not the blood of a sacrifice on an altar, but a cold-blooded murder committed by the woman who would call herself his mother. She wrapped the boy in royal silk, staining his destiny with a secret that would one day burn the entire empire to ash. As the Nile's floods came and went, the infant salvaged from the reeds transformed into a man of staggering presence. Moses was a titan of the court, possessing a mind as sharp as a Kopesh blade and a voice that commanded the desert winds. To the world, he was the crown jewel of Egypt, a golden prince destined to sit at the right hand of the pharaoh. But to Bithiah, he was a masterpiece of deception, a ticking time bomb hidden beneath layers of royal silk and heavy gold. She had saved his body from the river, but now she was engaged in a far more brutal task. She had to kill his soul. To keep the secret of his birth buried, Bithiah didn't just raise a son. She constructed a psychological fortress. She surrounded him with the finest priests and magicians, filling his ears with the myths of Ra and Osiris, to drown out the haunting rhythmic chants of the Hebrew slaves that drifted over the palace walls at night. But Bithiah knew that a lie, no matter how magnificent, is still a fragile thing. She watched Moses with a mixture of fierce protective love and a paralyzing cold terror. While other Egyptian nobles looked at the Hebrew laborers and saw mere beasts of burden, Moses looked at them and felt a phantom pain in his own bones. He began to have dreams of a mother who didn't wear a crown and a sister who sang songs in a language he wasn't supposed to know. Every time he questioned why his heart ached at the sound of a slave's whip, Bithiah would tighten her grip. She became a shadow in the palace, a silent orchestrator of fear. She ordered the quiet execution of any midwife who remembered the year of the Nile killings. She scrubbed his history clean with the blood of anyone who knew the truth, desperate to mold a Hebrew prophet into an Egyptian conqueror. She was fighting a war against God himself, and for a long time, it looked like she was winning. The illusion finally began to shatter during a scorching summer military parade. Ramses, the true blood heir, and a man who smelled the scent of a commoner on Moses, decided it was time to tear down the facade. In an act of calculated public cruelty, Ramses forced Moses to oversee the lashing of a Hebrew elder, a man so frail, his ribs looked like the hull of a broken ship. From her high balcony, Bithiah watched her hands trembling As she gripped the stone railing, she saw the sun glint off the whip. She saw Moses stand frozen, his jaw locked so tight his teeth threatened to shatter. In that moment, a silent conversation happened across the courtyard. Bithiah saw the prince's mask slip, revealing the raw, bleeding heart of a brother to the enslaved. She realized that no matter how much incense she burned or how much gold she draped over his shoulders, she could never wash the Nile out of his spirit. The boy she had stolen from the water was waking up, and the very hands she had used to save him were now the hands that would eventually dismantle her world. The air inside the palace grew thick with a silence that screamed. The royal parade hadn't just shaken Moses. It had shattered the golden illusion Bithiah spent decades building. She could feel her son slipping through her fingers like desert sand. Moses was no longer interested in the feasts of Pharaoh. He began to vanish into the night, discarding his jeweled sandals to walk barefoot among the mud pits of Goshen. He was a man haunted by a ghost, the ghost of the person he was meant to be. Bithiah watched from the shadows, her love turning into a desperate, suffocating obsession. She knew that if Moses ever looked too closely into the eyes of a slave, he wouldn't just find a brother. He would find a reason to destroy her world, to save her empire. Bithiah decided to strike first. She planned a massive coronation to name Moses the Eternal Sword of Egypt, a title that would bind his soul to the pagan gods through a ritual of blood. She thought that if she could just crown him, she could own him. But God had a different plan. On a day when the sun beat down like a hammer, Moses stood atop a half-finished monument. Below him, an Egyptian taskmaster was laughing as he beat an elderly Hebrew slave to the verge of death. It wasn't a common punishment. It was a slow, sadistic murder. In that moment, the years of brainwashing the Egyptian silk and the palace lies evaporated. Something ancient and powerful woke up inside Moses. With a roar that echoed like a desert storm, Moses descended. He didn't just stop the beating. He unleashed a lifetime of repressed fury. In a flash of violence, the taskmaster's life ended in the very dirt he had forced others to worship. Moses buried the body, convinced the shifting sands would hide his sin. But when he returned to the palace, the lights were low, and Bithiah was waiting. She stood by a flickering torch, holding a blood-stained scrap of his tunic that he had accidentally torn. Her face wasn't twisted in anger, but in a terrifying, hollow grief. "I murdered a man to save your life when you were a babe," she whispered, her voice cold and trembling. "And today you murdered a man to throw that life away." The confrontation was like a knife through the heart of their relationship. Moses looked at the woman who had raised him, and finally saw the blood on her hands. The blood of the guards, the midwives, and the system she defended. He realized his mother had saved his life, only to steal his soul. "You didn't save a son, Bithiah," Moses said, his voice echoing with the weight of a prophet. "You raised a ghost, and ghosts don't belong in palaces." That night, the prince of Egypt vanished into the starlit wastes of Midian. Bithiah stood alone on the high walls, watching her miracle walk away to become her nightmare. She had protected the seed, but she had never realized that the fruit would one day poison her entire kingdom. 40 years had turned the palace into a gilded tomb. For Bithiah, every corridor was haunted by the echoes of a son she had stolen and then lost to the desert. She had watched the empire she sacrificed her soul for grow cold and cruel under Ramses, a pharaoh who believed he was a god. But the desert does not keep secrets forever. Rumors began to bleed into the city, whispers of a prophet in the wasteland with a staff that could split the earth. Bithiah's heart, long since turned to ash, began to spark with a terrifying recognition. When the massive bronze doors of the great hall finally shattered open, it wasn't a long-lost prince seeking forgiveness who entered. It was a man who looked like he had walked through the fire of God and survived. Moses stood there, his hair white as the Sinai peaks, his eyes burning with a light that made the palace lamps seem dim and pathetic. The reunion was a brutal, cold collision of two destinies. Bithiah stood trembling in the shadow of the throne, her eyes searching for the boy she used to wrap in royal silk. But that boy was dead. In his place was a liberator who looked through her as if she were made of glass. Moses didn't come to offer an embrace. He came to demand an exodus. When Ramses spat in the face of the nameless god, the world began to unravel. The first plague was a poetic nightmare that struck Bithiah harder than any physical blow. The Nile turned to blood. It was as if the river itself was finally screaming out the truth she had tried to silence 40 years ago. The water that had once hidden a Hebrew baby was now exposing the sins of an entire empire. As the months passed, Bithiah watched the 10 plagues dismantle everything she held dear. She saw the sun she had worshipped, eclipsed by a darkness so thick it could be felt. She saw the gold of the palace lose its luster as locusts and hail stripped the land of its pride. Every time she tried to speak to Moses to plead for the Egypt she loved, he remained a pillar of stone. She realized with a crushing horror that she hadn't nurtured a weapon for her own house. She had nursed the very lion that was now tearing it apart. The love she had used to protect him had been a lie, and now the truth was a fire consuming her life. The final night, the night of the Passover, was the darkest of all. The air was heavy with the scent of lamb's blood and the approaching shadow of death. Bithiah sat alone in her chamber, surrounded by silent idols that offered no comfort. Suddenly a shadow fell across the floor. Moses appeared to her one last time. There was no anger in his voice, only a devastating clarity. He offered her a chance to leave, to cross the threshold and join the people of his blood. But Bithiah looked at her father's throne and the ruins of her world. She had betrayed her gods once for a child, but she could not betray her identity again. Moses looked at her with a grief that surpassed words, knowing he was leaving her behind in a world about to be judged. He left without a final touch, his shadow vanishing into the night. As the firstborn of Egypt began to fall, and the wailing of 1,000 mothers rose like a storm, Bithiah realized the ultimate tragic truth. She had loved Moses more than Egypt, but Moses loved the truth more than he ever loved her. The miracle she had pulled from the water had finally become the flood that would wash her history away. The morning after the Passover was not a beginning, but a funeral for an entire nation. Egypt lay in ruins, its streets echoing with the cries of mothers whose firstborn sons would never wake up. But inside the heart of Pharaoh, Ramses' grief had been replaced by a cold, demonic rage. He didn't see the hand of God. He only saw the defiance of a brother he now hated. "Ready the chariots!" he roared, his voice trembling with the madness of a fallen king. He would not let them go. He would turn the sands of the desert red with their blood. Bithiah, now a shadow of her former self, watched him from the palace steps. She knew this was the final chapter. She climbed into her own chariot, driven by a ghost-like compulsion to see the end of the miracle she had stolen from the Nile 40 years ago. The chase was a nightmare of dust and thundering hooves. 600 elite chariots, the pride of the Egyptian military, tore across the desert like a swarm of golden locusts. When they reached the edge of the Red Sea, they saw the Hebrews trapped against the endless blue of the water. Ramses laughed, drawing his Kopesh sword. He looked at Moses, who stood on a high rock silhouetted against the crashing waves. To Ramses, Moses was a rebel slave. To Bithiah, he was a son she no longer recognized. Then the impossible happened. Moses raised his staff, and the wind began to howl with the fury of 1,000 storms. The sea didn't just move, it surrendered. The waters split into 2 massive sapphire walls, revealing a path of dry land. Bithiah watched in paralyzed awe as the Hebrews vanished into the abyss of the sea, protected by a pillar of fire. "After them!" Ramses screamed, his eyes bloodshot with insanity. He drove his chariot into the seabed, followed by the entire might of Egypt. The walls of water loomed over them miles high, held back by an invisible hand. In the center of that watery grave, the chariot wheels began to lock. The mud of the deep clung to the golden spokes. Ramses lashed his horses, screaming curses at the God of Israel. But at the far shore, Moses turned. His eyes met Bithiah's for one final agonizing second. In that look, there was no hate, only a profound, eternal goodbye. Moses lowered his staff. The sound was like the world breaking apart. The pillars of water collapsed with the weight of a mountain. Ramses, the Lord of two lands, had only enough time to see the ocean of his own destruction descending upon him. He was swallowed by the very water he thought he owned his crown, sinking into the dark silt of the deep. Bithiah felt the cold embrace of the sea, the salt stinging her eyes as it washed away the Egyptian silk and the blood of the secrets she had kept. The dynasty was gone. The pharaoh was a corpse. And as the sun rose over the far shore, Moses stood with his people. The prince of Egypt was buried forever under the waves, and the prophet of God was born. The secret of the Nile was finally washed clean by the sea that took a kingdom, but gave birth to a nation. The Red Sea was silent once more, its waves washing up the golden wreckage of a civilization. On the eastern shore, the air was filled with the deafening cheers of 1,000,000 freed slaves, dancing to the rhythm of timbrels and songs of victory. But Moses stood apart from the celebration. He walked alone along the waterline, his feet sinking into the wet sand, where the debris of his past lay scattered. He watched the tide bring in the broken pieces of Egyptian chariots' gilded wheels snapped like toys, and fragments of royal silk, the very silk Bithiah had once wrapped him in to hide his bloodline. His heart was a battlefield. He had won a nation, but he had buried his mother. Every time a body washed ashore, he searched the cold, dead faces, terrified and longing to see the woman who had sinned so deeply to save him. The ghost of Bithiah did not leave him in the desert. As they marched deeper into the burning wilderness, Moses realized that taking the people out of Egypt was easy, but taking the prince of Egypt out of his own soul was a task even a god might find impossible. Every night in the silence of his tent, the flickering lamp would cast shadows that looked like the palace walls. He could still hear her whisper in the wind, a chilling reminder of their final confrontation. "You raised a ghost." He was no longer a golden prince of the Nile. He was a shepherd of a rebellious, starving multitude. The luxury of the palace, the cool marble, the wine, the absolute power was gone, replaced by the relentless grit of sand and the constant agonizing presence of a god who demanded everything. In the dead of night, Moses would look at his hands, the hands that had once held an Egyptian scepter and then a shepherd's staff. He realized that the secret Bithiah had died for was now his to carry alone. She had traded her soul for a son, and he had traded his mother for a nation. He stood on a high dune, looking back toward the west, where the sun had set over the ruins of Egypt. He was free, yet he was more of a prisoner than he had ever been, shackled by the memory of a woman who loved him enough to destroy the world for him. The secret of the Nile was not buried under the waves. It was alive in his heart, a silent crimson shadow that would follow him until the day he drew his last breath. The miracle was complete, but the prince was gone, and only the ghost remained. The prince is dead, but the prophet has just been born. The desert holds more secrets than the Nile ever did. If you want to witness the fire of Sinai and the ultimate fate of Moses, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment with "The Journey Continues," and don't miss our next chapter. The real war for the soul of Israel has only just begun.